Hey there everyone, this is the Vintage Sewing Machine Garage. I am bringing to you the next installment, if you will, of my videos on vintage sewing machine attachments, feet, and so forth. This particular video focuses on some of, but certainly not all of, the various sewing feet that you might have access to. And many of you, if you've gotten a vintage sewing machine recently, or maybe you have inherited one, you may have some of these things and not even know what they are. Or you might. If you do, then it would be great to to confirm that. Whenever I think I understand what I've got, I sometimes go around looking to make sure that other people sort of concur with what I'm sometimes having to estimate. So what you're looking at here is, this is a box. It says Singer on it. Now, many of you, when you get a sewing machine, no matter what brand it is, it doesn't have to be a Singer brand machine. Many of the sewing feet that would have been used by people in the vintage era would have actually been manufactured either by Singer, in this case, or sometimes they were manufactured by a company called Greist, G-R-E-I-S-T, or it may be pronounced Greist, I'm not sure. In any case, that brand was known to manufacture quite a few feet and accessories for sewing machine companies like Singer, just as I think I mentioned in the video on sewing machine attachments and devices that you would use to create certain sewing effects. And so I wanted to kind of give you an overview. These are just the machine feet that I have in my own inventory. And this is by no means an exhaustive review. That would take a long time because there were lots of different types of feet that you could get. I wanted to start with what I think was what today we might call a starter set. Keep in mind that when people went to buy sewing machines back in the day, the machines were very expensive, as I have mentioned to you folks, and also the sewing machine tables, they were also pretty pricey. So it probably would have been smart of a dealer, such as a Singer dealer, to provide its customer with at least some of the attachments that they might use. How many they included, I really don't know. But I can tell you that the following, I'm going to show you a number of sewing machine feet, but I'm starting with these because these have shown up consistently in many of the either the tables or the carrying cases, or sometimes it's just in a bag. When I get any kind of sewing accessories or sewing feet, these are the most common ones I see. In fact, I sometimes have more than one copy of these things because they tend to be more plentiful. They appear more often than some of the others. So let's take a look at this one you see me playing with here. This is one of the most essential. This is a straight stitch sewing foot. Now most of these are low shank. I talked about shank in the other video, but I wanted to talk about the feet themselves. Keep in mind that until the late 40s, early 50s, when the Italian company Necchi brought zigzag to home sewing machines, all of the sewing machines prior to that were straight stitch sewing machines. They made what's called a lock stitch, and that's what they did. And if you wanted to do anything else, you had to have various attachments, such as those that I showed in the video I did on attachments. So again, this would have been a foot you used a lot, and many of you on your vintage sewing machines will also use it quite a bit. And you can get new versions of these. And if you ever look at a new sewing machine foot, they're fine, they function, but they're not made as well. They're a little rougher. They're not as, this little humble straight stitch sewing foot, I believe it came off of a low shank Singer. This little foot is machined and polished in a way that they just don't do with the new feet. Now, there may be exceptions to that. I haven't seen all of the new sewing feet, but many of those you get in the sewing store today. They're okay. There's nothing wrong with them, and you may need them sometimes for use on your vintage sewing machine. Next up, I wanted to show this to you. Now, many of you may have seen this. You may or may not know how it's used. This is called a shirring, S-H-I-R-R-I-N-G, or shirer foot. And it's also called a gathering foot. And I'm going to try to turn it at different angles so you guys can see it. Especially, let's look at it in profile and notice that it is not like the straight stitch foot, which is very, when it sits down, the straight stitch, it's fairly flat except for the very front. But notice the gathering foot is not. It has a notch in the back. And what that allowed it to do is to gather or shirr fabric. And what you would get would be very, very small, narrow, I call them pleats, but that's not really a great way to describe them. And for those of you who know how to do gathering, please forgive this little picture. I'm trying to show the little gathers that you would form, and you would form those. They were very often used with dresses, particularly in the waist level of a woman's or a little girl's dress. And you know, you can often tell what the sewing trends and the fashions were back in the day, because you can tell by the types of sewing techniques that were popular. Some of them were very popular. I suspect that in many dresses, gathering feet were used quite a bit, because I see these with almost every machine that I get, if it has any original equipment. And right along that same theme, you would have also seen this. This is a ruffler or ruffling foot. And just as with the gathering foot, this would have been a very popular device. And if it did come standard with a machine, if the dealer decided to do that, keep in mind that this would have been a fairly expensive foot to manufacture. And again, the quality of the machining is quite high. Many of the surfaces are nice and smooth. They are connected with, and you can see right back here, you can see where it was, they used grommets, right? I mean, this was not a cheap, if you were to make this today at this quality, I would imagine you'd pay a pretty penny for it. But, so of course, ruffling would have been very popular. Lots of people put dust ruffles at the base of their beds. People today still do. And there, of course, would have been ruffles in certain types of garments, and ruffles in things like window treatments. So ruffling was a pretty big deal, and many of you will see this. Again, this is not exclusive to Singer. Most of your vintage sewing machine brands had versions of these, and certainly not necessarily a secondary. I see this foot very often. So take a look at this. This is a low shank version of the foot, and it has this sort of cone-shaped structure, and it has slots in it, and it is called a slotted binder foot. What it means by binding, if those of you who are sewers may know this, of course, binding is when you take a narrow strip of fabric and you cover the edges of an item you're sewing. And the best way to describe this would be to give you examples. A baby's bib, a kitchen apron. Very often these were trimmed in edging with a contrasting color compared to the body fabric that was used. And this was, like I say, I see this in virtually every sewing foot collection that I have. These are very common. So that tells you that that was a fairly popular thing that people wanted to sew back in the day. This foot is called a rolled hem or rolled hemmer foot. Now, many of you will have seen this, and you may or may not have known what it was. If you look at it sort of from above here, make sure we get some light on there for you. You would have taken your fabric and the raw edge that you had on a woven fabric. Obviously, you've got to sew that edge. You've got to get it sewn, or you're going to have raveling. So you would take fabric, and you would, you can find much better illustrations than this, but I'm trying to show the foot to you. You would use this, and if you could get the fabric pinched just right, you could get this little foot to help you get a nice, secure edge to your fabric seams. Now, This is the 1/4 inch hammer foot. They even made, more rarely seen, an 1/8 inch. How in the world anyone ever used that is beyond me, because it takes very small fingers and a lot of dexterity to pull it off. But these would have been used, particularly this size and the smaller 1/8 inch, they would have been used for things like handkerchiefs or silk scarves when you wanted you wanted that rolled hem or edge to be really narrow, super narrow, right? So, and then this, of course, this is the other very commonly found foot. This is called an adjustable hammer foot, and it has a set screw. So with this foot, you can see me pulling, it actually pulls out like this, and then of course it moves laterally as well. And you will often see these in the nickel plate, and you also see sometimes a combination of nickel and black side finish. And again, as I've mentioned before, black side is a finish you would see, you saw a lot of it during the Second World War when we had shortages of a lot of important metals such as nickel. Continuing on, guys, a foot that would have been very important in the vintage era and is still important today is the zipper foot. Now, you use this foot when you were sewing on zippers, and this foot is, I guess it's the more narrow of these two. You will also see, get my fingers out of the way here so you can actually see what I'm describing. You see the one on the right is thicker or wider than the more narrow version, but both of them have little notches on the side. And the notches were used sometimes as a cording foot. You could do cording. Think upholstery fabrics. You might make a slip cover and wanted a corded edge. That is something you would have used those little gaps for, or you might have had your own separate cording feet. Here is a right biased cording foot, and you see the notch on the right side. These were often sold in pairs, and you would have the opposite. You would have a left hand. I'm turning this upside down so you can see. But then you would have had one with a notch on the left side, and you could have done your cording from left or right. But again, this is a specialized foot, and it would have been, if you did cording, you would have had a foot to use for that. Now, some of you will also see this foot fairly often, and this is called an edger foot or edging foot. And it looks kind of, like they went to great lengths to set it up a certain way. And the reason for this has to do with when you're lining up the edges of fabrics. People used to do lots of sewing with things like lace and applique. And when you were working with very delicate fabrics and they were sort of high profile, people would notice the edges a lot. You wanted your edges to be aligned, and you didn't have much margin for error. And it could really go badly for your project if you didn't have something like this. And so again, it is a reflection of some of the types of things that people would have sewn once upon a time. Now, there are 2 feet here, and both of them are used for zigzag work. Hold this, I'm going to do one at a time so I don't get in my own way here, right? So this is a zigzag foot, and you know this because you see, as I've described, I think I described it the other day, you see this sort of an oval slat opening there, so the needle can move from side to side. And then if you look at the bottom, there's a slight indentation, but it's mostly smooth and flat. You don't have a lot of space under there, a little bit. Some of you, if you have a Singer slant machine, or in my case, this was in a sewing bag and it didn't come with the slant, this is called a special stitch foot or a decorative stitch foot. And it is a slant shank foot. And as far as I know, I've only ever seen them in the slant shank, and there's a reason for that. This is of no use on the Singer 301 because that, of course, it's a slant shank machine, but straight stitch only. But once Singer came out with the Singer 400 Slant-O-Matic series, as well as the 500 and even the 600, this foot was necessary. a lot of those decorative stitches were designed, and they were often referred to as embroidery stitches. It's not true embroidery, but it was trying to get the appearance of embroidery. Well, what would happen, of course, is that if you took your zigzag foot, which you can also have on those Singer slant-o-matic machines, if you take your zigzag and you're going, as you're making decorative stitches, sometimes the bottom of the foot would snag, and it would pull on the threads of those decorative stitches, because they would sometimes, they would have some three-dimensional thickness to them, and so you would use this foot, because I'm showing you guys the bottom side. If you look underneath the decorative stitch foot, notice it has a nice gap there. It makes a space for all of those decorative, quote, embroidery, unquote, stitches, and the idea was to prevent damage to these decorative stitches that you had gone all the trouble to make, and you'd be a lot happier if they weren't ruined by a traditional or a regular zigzag foot. So if you've ever seen this and wondered, okay, why does this thing look this way? It was all about not damaging the decorative stitches that Singer machines could now make once they had zigzag. Moving right along, guys, there's a foot, and it has a nice little protective cover on it. And this foot would have appeared again once we get into the zigzag era. You really wouldn't see this on a straight stitch machine, but traditionally with straight stitch buttons, there are techniques for sewing on buttons with a straight stitch machine, but they're they're kind of a pain sometimes. But this is a button foot, and this foot, and they come in slightly different shapes, but this one is an example of a button foot where you would hold the button down with the foot, and that would allow you to take your very modern zigzag sewing machine, and very slowly and carefully you could use the zigzag stitch to sew between the holes in the button, and it would give you a nice solid connection for the button. Any of you who know how to sew buttons by hand know that getting that button secured is a big deal. Now, a lot of you would have also seen a foot that looks like this. And again, it looks like a foot that was probably pretty costly to produce. It is held together with rivets. It is beautifully machined and polished. Again, you just don't see quality like this. I know it sounds a little nerdy or geeky to talk about the quality of the machining of a sewing foot, but it is again a reflection, just like the machines and the tables. It's a reflection of another time when things were made differently. All consumer items were given a level of quality you just don't see very much today. But anyway, this is called a tucker foot, and it was used and still can be used for the sewing technique known as pin tucking. Now, if any of you have ever seen fabrics where the fabric is layered in such a way it almost looks like louvers, or sort of like big Venetian blinds, that's the best thing I can show you. If you look up videos on pin tucking, you'll see what I mean. This was the foot that you would use on vintage sewing machines to make that happen. And there are little measured markings here, so you can adjust it with the set screw, so you know exactly what your pin tucks are going to be. How wide will they be? Anyway, another beautiful and very costly foot. They're not costly now, but they certainly would have been when they were new. And I'm pretty sure this would have been an optional foot. You would have had to pay extra for that. Now, those of you who have done darning, these were referred to as darning feet. Today, we often refer to them as free motion feet. And you can get new ones that have bigger, this little round area, which is really the foot surface. It's like a donut, right? And you can get them today with larger foot base. The circle is larger. Sometimes they are open. The plastic ones are popular because you can see through to what the foot is covering. But these are important when you're darning or you're going to do free motion embroidery. Now, one thing to note here, these feet, unlike many of the others, which are very interchangeable with lots of different brands of machine, as long as you have the right shank, but these are a little different, because if you look I'm going to hold them this way so you guys can see. If you see the little angled arm on both of these, notice the angle's a little different, and so is the shape. This little arm, when you attach these feet to the machine, to the presser bar, this arm fits either above or below the set screw for your needle clamp. And these vary depending on the machine. So even though both of these are low shank, they don't necessarily work with every machine. So those of you who are looking for these, be sure to do your research online and make sure that they're going to fit. But they are, again, they're made with the same quality as all these other feet I've been showing you. Now, I'm wondering if any of you have ever come across feet. They often come in a set, and they look something like this. They have these little pigtail curlicue shapes to them. They often come in multiple sizes, and you look at them, it's kind of obvious that they come and they're designed to create different widths of what they are for. If any of you haven't guessed, these are, and you notice the small one looks an awful lot like that Hammerfoot. Now, many of you who are used to using newer sewing feet, particularly on your newer sewing machines, you have noticed that, of course, you can get sewing machine feet that are clip-on style, right? Where you can you have a shank and a set screw on your machine. It may or may not look like this. These are vintage. And then you keep that attached to the machine, and then you can clip on feet. Well, actually, having feet with adapters is not new. In fact, they go way back. Now, this set is, when I first saw these, I used to get these in the sewing notions and the little boxes and places I would get equipment with the sewing machines I bought, and I didn't know what they were. And then when I would go to try to attach it to the machine, I couldn't, because I couldn't figure out how they attached. I was a little confused by that for a while, and then one day I noticed, and it's easy to miss, but one of my sewing feet had a little something behind it. And that little something, of course, was the adapter. So a lot of you folks may have these, and if you will go back into your stash and look at them, most of them are going to look like this, and this is where the foot attaches to the adapter, or the adapter shank, whatever you wish to call it. But you've got to have that adapter, but you only need one adapter. And if you start looking for one of those feet that might have something attached to it, like it may look like this, which is, you could easily miss that in a box, or you just may see it sitting there. So this particular one was for a zigzag setup, and this one was for a straight stitch. Okay, and we know that because there's just a hole for a straight stitch needle motion to go through. Now, one thing to note, these are not universal. This particular adapter, if you will, let's see if you guys can see this up close, and you'll notice you pinch this one, and when you do, this is going to show up on camera. When you do this, it reveals this little bolt, if you will, which is where the which is where the foot is going to attach. Now, if you try this one, it won't work, and that's because it's designed to go with feet that have this opening. And if you look, you'll see that the openings, and you can see it right here. Look at these two. You see the back plate? They have different size openings, and they're for different adapters. So if I want this to attach, I'm going to pinch. The pinching action, I don't know if you guys are going to see this or not, but what I'm doing is when I pinch this, it pushes this little bolt or knob forward. And so the first thing I do is I line up the foot on the large opening where the little arched round space is, around that. As soon as I pinch, I can slide it. Okay? So what I did was I pinched it to slide it. I just took it back off. So again, I'm holding this, right? I apply this very wide opening. I put that little, I call it a bolt. And then I'm going to I'm going to pinch behind. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I'm going to pinch that. And when I do, it moves that bolt forward and it gives me space to slide the foot into place. And make sure it's lined up so that your needle's not going to smash or hit anything, and you're ready to go. Now, I really like these because these are, in this particular case, these are rolled hem feet, but they are in larger, they're for larger hems. Some of them go, oh gosh, 1/2 inch, 3/4, even an inch hem. I don't know, you may or may not have use for that. And these adapters were not only for these feet, all kinds. Here's an edger foot that was used for the adapter. Here is a slotted binder. So if you didn't want to swap out a slotted binder foot, you could take off whatever foot you were using and slide this on. Now, this adapter is different. This was set up for a zigzag machine, and it has a little set screw, and I don't have to pinch it. It's a little easier for me to use. I have large fingers. If you have small fingers and hands, you might be able to have a little more success. This goes with, let's take a larger one so you can see. This foot and the mounting plate from the back, I'm trying to hold this where you guys can see it without my fingers in the way. There we go. So you see the plate pattern in the back, okay? So now I'm going to take it, and here is the side that's going to mount. This is what's going to mount to your presser bar, and you see the place where the set screw is going to go, right here. So I'm going to, again, same as I did with the other, I'm going to take this, move this out of the way, and I'm going to take where the knob is, I'm going to take the wide part of this backing plate on the foot, and I'm simply going to slide it over. And again, this adapter would be mounted on the sewing machine, so I wouldn't be having to hold it. It would be mounted already, and I would simply come over here, start with the wide area, and then slide it across, and then just snug to the right, that little set screw, and make sure that it's in line with my zigzag so I don't break my needle, and there you go. And it's actually kind of clever. And it, like I say, some of you may have these. A lot of people have these and they have no idea what they are, because either they have lost the adapter or they have the adapter, but they don't know they have an adapter. It kind of looks, you know, kind of like a strange little zigzag sewing foot, but it's not what it is. If you see the little set screw on the back, chances are you have a foot that was designed to put, you have an adapter that was designed for different feet. Now, I'll show you guys this, and this is the segue to one of the last feet I'm going to show you. This, first I thought this was a underbraider, and I'm going to explain in a minute what those are. But this foot, if you look at the side, it has a place for your set screw right there above. And then there's a little hole and a set screw, another set screw built into the foot, or the adapter is what this is. Maybe it's both, in the back. Now, I have a seam guide. Now, this seam guide that I'm holding, this long rod, you sometimes see these little rods with the little curved end, right? Sort of a 90-degree piece. Looks like the little piece of a sleigh or something. But anyway, this rod does not fit this adapter, but I'm using it to show you how this would work. So the rod would slide into the hole on the side, and then you would take your set screw and you would clamp it down, and then this would be a way to use yet another a sewing foot. This is a straight stitcher with a seam guide. Quilters would often use these, and of course this one is not set up to work with this, but if it did, of course you could adjust it laterally, right? So you could adjust your seam, and it would help you with guiding seams, particularly on some of your thicker stuff like quilts. Now, I finally realized what this foot was for, and it took me a while because it tricked me, because I have other feet, and they took a long time to identify and just try to figure out what they were. And I have two of them here. Now, you all know that the term rare is a word, that's a word I rarely use. Sorry for the pun, but most things are not rare in the vintage sewing machine world, but I think this might be. Take a look at this foot, guys. If you can see this, you'll notice that it has two holes, right? It has a hole on top, one on top of the other. Now the needle can only go in one of these holes, so why is there another one? This is called a braiding or under braider foot. Now braiding, I had to look up what the heck is braiding. Braiding was a decorative sewing technique that was used, and sometimes people would call it embroidery, but it was not embroidery. Here is another version, and this one has the hole, and then there's a little rod that separates that hole from a place where you can. There's like a little slit in the front, and then it may be out of focus here, and then the hole is separated by that very narrow space. So again, you would take braiding, which was like a very thick thread, almost like string. If you saw braiding, it would almost look like string to you, but it would come in different colors and decorative, and you would sew patterns of braiding, and as you fed the braiding through the foot, and I believe there are people with videos showing how this was done, as you would feed the braiding through the foot, the machine would sew it into place. So think about, you're taking the thread of your sewing machine and you're sewing very thick, almost string-like thread with your needle and your sewing thread. And you could create all sorts of interesting designs. I've seen some of this stuff in antique vintage garments, and it's really beautiful. But it must have been a technique that was either very specialized or maybe it had a short period of popularity, because these are the only two I have seen. Now, this is one of the two. The second one I showed you, I'm going to show it to you again. Look at the top of this foot, guys. Do you see that? It looks like a little wishbone. That is very similar. It's actually the same connection as this foot. This is a straight stitch foot, and some of you may recognize this and know what it is. I'm going to be doing a video very soon. I've been promising this for a long time, on a rotary style sewing machine, those that have the friction pulleys or the rubber pulley motors. And the White Company was for a very long time a huge competitor to Singer, and they intentionally made sure that their feet attached differently. And so when I demonstrate the machine and I talk about it, I will show how the feet go on. It's actually a really neat system, because you attach the foot front to back. This will make more sense when you see it on the machine. And then the machine has a wonderfully textured, very good-sized set screw that doesn't come off, so you don't lose it. It's actually a great system. I think it's underappreciated. But anyway, this is another, this doesn't really have a shank size. I call it the rotary shank. That's what I call it, because that's what it's designed for. Now, last but not least, I wanted to show you a foot this is a low shank foot, and it is shaped like this. Now, you sometimes will see plastic versions. These are later, by the late 60s and 70s, they started using plastic. It did allow you to see more of the work you were doing, particularly with decorative work. But I wanted to see if any of you know what this foot is. I actually will need to go online and research it, but I don't know. So if any of you would love to hear your comments and to see if you know what this foot is and what it's for. I'll hold it up again. First I thought it was zigzag, but it has this little heart shape, and there's a narrow slit where you can get thread through. And then this foot. This foot, if you look at it, and it's clear plastic, and it has a center slit, and then it has it's capable of zigzag stitching, but it has a sort of a gold anodized finish, and it came off of a Kenmore. Tell me if you know what this foot is and why it is unusual or specific to a certain kind of sewing. So there you go, guys. You've seen, and again, this is not by any means all of the sewing feet you would find in the vintage world. there's another set or another kind of foot connection, and that foot connection would have been revealed in a variety of styles at the very beginning of sewing machine manufacturing. So 150 years ago or more, the sewing machine business was new. There were lots of startups and lots of different types of foot design. Even Singer had different designs in terms of how you mount the feet. The feet looked similar in terms of their function sometimes, but how you mount them was different. When I showed you folks in my video on shanks for sewing feet, one of the things you may remember is that whether it was low shank, high, slant, the side or the connection where you would put the set screw to attach the foot pretty much looked like this. And this is a standard that Singer developed, and eventually most of the sewing world would adapt the same standard that Singer had. And of course they did this primarily because Singer was the biggest company, and if you mimicked certain specifications that Singer had without actually copying the design, it made your life easier if you wanted to sell a sewing machine when so many of your potential customers had either had a Singer in the past or they had things that would go with a Singer, and you didn't want to lose the sale. So anyway, I appreciate you guys watching. And again, for many years, I looked at sewing feet and had no idea what they were. I would try them and see if they would fit. So anyway, when you look at this video, think of it in conjunction with the video I made on the shank of sewing feet, as well as the video on sewing attachments and accessories, because there's a giant world of these things. And again, we didn't touch all of them, not even close. But at least, hopefully this was helpful. If you have any of these things in your possession, at least you may have a better idea of what they are for. And I will see if I can find a link. There are websites that may give you kind of a rundown, a visual, so you can look at the foot you have and see if you can identify it. I'll try to locate that and get it up on the video description for you guys. But if you have comments, please share them. And you may have sewing feet that you didn't see here. Let me know if you are trying to figure out what the sewing foot does, how it attaches, and we'll see what kind of answers we can get between me and all of those wonderful people out there who share their comments on the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will look for your comments below. Thanks so much.